Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 248, Being an Introvert Advocate. You'll have heard me say many times before that I consider myself an introvert advocate, and I use that term very deliberately because I've chosen to understand what it really means. And whilst it may sound noble to choose to advocate, it has to start with self. If I cannot advocate for myself, how will I have any credibility advocating for anyone else? So in this episode, I'm exploring what I mean when I say I'm an advocate, why it has to start with self, and how we can advocate for each other. When I call myself an advocate, it means I'm actively working to create awareness, to initiate change and enable empowerment. This gives you a glimpse of why I believe we have to be able to do this for ourselves before taking on a cause of some sort. Now, in my case, I advocate for introverts who find themselves disadvantaged by the bias towards the extrovert ideal in business and in education. That's because our needs, voices and rights as introverts are often overlooked or misunderstood. Seem a little strong? Good. The reality is the bias has been unrelenting, and decades of outdated practices have compounded the issue. I know how it feels because I've been there, and I'll share a little more on that in a moment. And I know that I'm always more interested in listening to someone who has walked the path that I'm currently on. I have short shrift for those who offer advice they've never had to take themselves. I quite like what Darren Hardy has to say on this topic when he says, "Never take advice from someone you wouldn't trade places with." That makes perfect sense to me, and just around the square, I also love this quote from Jim Kwik: "Don't take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from." You probably already know my views on the worthlessness of criticism by now. Give me constructive developmental feedback any day. That's actionable, whereas criticism is just an opinion. I mentioned that I'd share a little more about what I'd been through, and let me just say that I experienced the prejudice and the bias, the mocking and the contempt. During my early careers, I just pretended to be more extroverted in order to fit in and get on. It was my burnout from pretending and the realisation of my inauthenticity that eventually fired me up to get into action, initially for myself. I started owning my introversion, losing all sense of shame that I'd had. I began confidently playing to my strengths whenever possible and cheekily challenging the bias by rattling leaders' cages. In order to do that, to advocate for myself, there are 3 areas from my original definition that required my focus and attention. Number 1, I have a responsibility to continually raise my own awareness about who I am, about where I hold myself back or play small, and where my learning edges are before I'm really able to advocate for another. But that doesn't mean I'm the finished article. I'm not sure I ever will be. That's not the point. It does mean, however, that I remain curious and open to learning more. Number 2, following on from my enhanced awareness, what good is that unless I choose and follow through with the appropriate change? It is said that humans don't like change, but this is too broad a generalisation. Some of us like some types of change more than others. You see, it's also true that humans are hardwired to learn and grow. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, they both result in change of some sort. So I wonder if terminology is part of the problem here. We love to grow and learn, but change? No, that's too difficult. Honestly, it's laughable if you think you can have growth but without the change. And finally, then, number 3, empowerment. I consider this to be about having the confidence, skills, resources, and authority to take control over one's own life, own decisions, and actions. So I have to be able to demonstrate these things in my own life if I'm considering being an advocate for others. This also aligns with my need for integrity, as it would feel too incongruent to be inviting others to take more control if I can't do that for myself. So if we feel called to advocate for a group or an individual, check in with yourself first so that you're a sufficiently good role model for them. Once I was satisfied that I was advocating successfully for myself, I was able to begin advocating for others who found themselves in a similar position and were frustrated by it. It became necessary to add the frustrated part, as there were many people in the grip of the bias who had accepted it as their fate. Their limiting and self-limiting beliefs are so entrenched that their emotion is more resignation than frustration. And of course, that frustrates the hell out of me, as I know there are so many possibilities for we introverts. But I'm also pragmatic. I can't help everyone, especially if they're not yet ready to be helped. And some will never be. And I have to accept that that's okay too. So once we have started advocating for ourselves, and remember, we don't need to be the finished article as long as we're work in progress, how do we start advocating for others? I think the place to start is by standing up for our fellow introverts. My business principles have helped me here, as they're derived from my values, so together they guide my intentions and actions. My guiding principles are purposefully curious. As a lifelong learner, I'm excited to learn and grow for my benefit and also for those I advocate for. I will never be complacent about what I know and what there is still to learn. Resolutely pragmatic. I'm an engineer at heart and by training, so co-creating practical, actionable solutions that are significant and sustainable is an absolute must for me. Supportively challenging. I encourage introverts to flourish not by colluding with them or their stories, but by showing them that they can be all that they hoped and more. Quietly gutsy. I'm determined, bold and courageous, but not in a big shouty way. I will step into the limelight if the situation demands and will keep working away behind the scenes in a spirited fashion. Finally, unwavering advocacy. My intention is always to help introverts to express their views and stand up for what is right. I am prepared to be the voice of the unheard introvert. That was a line that I said in my TEDx talk in 2019, a line that I didn't know I was going to say, and it's resonated deeply with me ever since. I'm more than happy for people to assess, measure, or hold me to account by how I live these principles. If you've not yet done the work to understand your values and establish your working principles, I strongly suggest you do. And you don't have to run your own business to have principles about how you behave in a professional business environment. It's so important, in fact, that we explore this early on in the journey during the course of Frustrated to Flourishing. So how do we successfully advocate for each other? Advocacy can take many forms, but at its heart, for I do believe there is a huge beating heart driving advocacy. It's about championing others' rights, needs and contributions, thereby making a positive difference. And you don't need a given title of leader to do this. If it's easy for me to see where the bias lurks in organisations, I'm sure it's easy for you to both see and feel it in your own environment. Advocates have a responsibility to stick their head above the parapet and be prepared to discuss the undiscussable in order to raise awareness. For instance, what happens when the same people dominate meetings? Who makes space for the quieter ones who have been trying to get a word in edgeways? Not by saying, "We haven't heard from you yet, Joe, what do you have to add?" but by calling attention to the fact that the same people have all of the airtime. So maybe like this: I'd like to hear from others about this issue so we get a broader perspective. It's time we spoke out about the need for fair participation. What about when the office gets too noisy and the banter is distracting? Who says, "Okay, let's have some peace and quiet for the next 45 minutes so that we can all focus"? We know you'll probably face a bit of a kickback for speaking up, but that's what advocates are prepared for. It's time we spoke out about the need for workplaces to be somewhere we can actually get work done, rather than it being a comedy store. What about when the most skilled and experienced person in the team doesn't get invited to participate in the project because they are, and I quote, "too quiet"? Who speaks up for them and says, "I think we should include Joe in the project if we want it to go well"? It's time we spoke out about the need for equitable inclusion, thereby challenging the proximity and affinity aspects of the extraversion bias. After all, we know well enough now that diverse contributions lead to better outcomes. Einstein is reported to have said something similar to, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Diversity of thought comes from allowing dissenting voices airtime, which only happens when we eliminate groupthink and conformity bias, also elements of the extraversion bias. For instance, climate change will not be rectified by the fossil fuel industry alone. And of course, you don't need to be an introvert to advocate for us, but you do need to have an empathic understanding of the challenges we face. Genuine allies and advocates are most welcome. So we've explored what advocacy is, how we would do well to start with self-advocacy, and finished with a few simple examples of where we need to be better advocates for each other in business settings. Here's the thing though. Some of you will have nodded along throughout, but when it comes time for action, you metaphorically take one step back. What will people think of me? I'll be judged as a troublemaker. Then that's my career down the pan. I'll just stay quiet and keep my head down. The time has passed for us to keep our heads down and our noses clean. This is the era of the collaborator, the positive rebels like you and me who support each other as we create our ripples of change. Nothing changes without people being motivated, inspired, or moved to take action. And this isn't about making life easier for introverts. It's about righting an injustice that seems to be the last acceptable bias. I'd not thought of it that way until a well-respected client of mine used that term. Just think of that, the extraversion bias as the last acceptable bias. There's a fair degree of truth in his statement. After all, it's not legislated against, plus education and business still promotes its virtues, albeit covertly. And that's why I advocate for myself and my fellow introverts. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.